Hi everybody, Ford here from SonovaStitch, and welcome to the first episode of SonovaStitchToob, my instructional videos on cross-stitching. I decided that for the first sequence of videos, probably the best thing to do would be to go back to the basics and start from the very beginning. So whether you're somebody who's just getting into cross-stitching, or somebody who taught yourself and thinks maybe you missed something, or just somebody who wonders if other people do it a different way, this video could probably contain some good information for you. We're going to start at the very basics from reading a pattern, and we're going to move on up to some of the more advanced stitching techniques. But for the start here, we're going to go from the very basics. And I decided that the easiest way for us to do that would be if we all worked on the same project together. So I've created a pattern just for this purpose. Most of the time, instructional videos or basic starter kits and stuff have some sort of cutesy kitschy bullshit, but I didn't want to do that. So we're going to do something a little nerdier. We're going to do something a little snarkier. We're going to make this project. Let's get that focused and a little bit bigger for you. So I've created the pattern for this and I've posted it online so that we can do this together. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is go and grab that pattern. It's in PDF format and I've uploaded it to a shareable site, and the URL for that is bit.ly/fungi pattern with a capital F and a capital P. I'm going to put that URL right here once I figure out how to use my video editing software. So first thing, go ahead and grab that pattern right now and either bring it up on a screen. You can put it up there or over there or over there, or you can go ahead and print it out if you prefer to work off of a paper pattern. That's usually what I do. I tend to like to be able to hold my pattern and examine it closely and compare what I've done to what I'm doing. So go ahead and get that, and then let's move on to the next step. Pause for download. Okay, so now that you've got that pattern, presumably next to my face or in front of yours, we're going to take a look at this pattern and I'll explain to you all the different things that you're seeing there. Part of the reason I picked this pattern for this is that it covers most of the basic things that you're going to see in more entry-level cross stitches. So we can go over most of the things that you'll need to know. So let's take a look at the first thing here. First thing that you're going to notice is that your pattern is a grid. I'm going to just go ahead and put the pattern up onto the screen while I talk for a little bit here, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, now that you've downloaded your pattern and either printed it out or pulled it up on the screen, you should be seeing something pretty much like this. We're going to take a couple of basic observations first. You'll notice that it's on a grid. We have these grid lines here to help us count, and we also have numbers over on the side that can help us as an absolute frame of reference as well. So that can make our lives a little bit easier as we're trying to go through the pattern. You'll also notice that this pattern, like all of my patterns, has both colored blocks and little symbols to indicate which colors we're using. Now sometimes you'll also have a key on your grid page, but on this particular pattern, the key is on a separate page. So over here on the key, we've got an indication of what symbol we're looking at. Camera will not stay in focus. Of what symbol we're looking at and what color that is. We've got a thread manufacturer. I only use DMC in my patterns, so that's pretty redundant. But then we've also got a designation, which is usually a number, a description, which is not actually provided by DMC. This may vary from designer to designer or from retailer to retailer, so don't worry too much if that description is not exactly the same on your pattern as it is on the bin where you buy it. And then on these ones, because my patterns are pretty comprehensive, you'll also see I've told you how many stitches of that color you're going to use and how much floss you can expect that to use up. So let's go back to the first page here. And you can see that those patterns that were appearing on the key are now also appearing here on this main page. And we've got a few different kinds of stitches here. So the first kind of stitch is indicated just by a symbol and a square. That is a full stitch, or an X stitch, or a cross stitch. That's the most common kind of stitch that you're going to use in cross stitching, and you'll become pretty familiar with those. And this pattern consists mostly of those. We do have a couple of other kind of stitches here that are pretty frequently used in cross stitching. The first is indicated by just a line here. You can see that pretty clearly with these black lines here. and with these darker orange lines right here. Now on your pattern, those are not orange. I changed my mind about the colors I wanted to use after I printed out mine, but I didn't want to waste the paper, so don't worry about that. The other kind of stitch that we've got here is this, see this little circle guy right there? It's got a circle and then a symbol, and we see that that symbol is the one that our key tells us is used for 310 black. So what this circular symbol indicates is what's known as a French knot. Now, if you know anybody who cross stitches or spend any time hanging out in cross stitch groups online, you'll probably hear most people say French knot and then either swear or spit. But we're going to do a whole episode on how to do French knots without tearing your hair out later, so don't freak out about those. We'll explain that, and I'll teach you my method that works quite reliably and is very easy to do. The other kind of stitch that we've got here, as I mentioned, is the straight lines. Those are called back stitches, and those are used to add detail and to add contrast to a pattern and to help outline things and make them look solid. We'll go over that in a later episode as well. And then the final stitch kind that we've got here, you see that this square has got only half of it filled in. It's got a triangular divider through the middle of the square, and then we've got a tiny little symbol there. Those are fractional stitches. Sometimes they're 1/4 stitches, sometimes they're 3/4 stitches, so they're a little bit context sensitive and something that you'll need to figure out based on the pattern. But we'll do an entire episode on fractional stitches, 3/4 and 1/4 stitches later as well. So again, don't worry about that. Don't let it freak you out. We'll go over it later. Now onto this second version of the pattern that I've given you. You'll notice in the middle here where we have color on the first page, we've got just black and white symbols. So this is what's known as a symbols only or black and white pattern. Some people, especially people who've been cross-stitching for a really long time or really work from old school designers, really prefer the symbols only. Personally, it makes my eyes wig out and I cannot read or parse or understand this. That is just not how my brain works. So that's why I do the symbols only, or the symbols with color one. The one thing that is different about this one here is that you'll notice the areas where we've got back stitching, some of these are a little hard to see. Like right here we've got a super light tan color, and that's really hard to figure out where that is and how many stitches of that. This is a pretty simple pattern, but sometimes that can be almost invisible. And as you can imagine, if we're, say, making words in white and all we have is like blanks in the grid, it becomes really hard to read those. So that's where this contrasting backstitch guide can come in really handy. Now, a lot of good designers will provide you with something like this to make your life a little bit easier. So on this one, you can see that we've got this blue line right up here on this corner square. And if we go to our backstitch guide key, we can see that a blue line indicates DMC 947, which is a burnt orange. So the colors of these have all been changed in order to make them contrast and make them easier to parse and to understand. So we've got that burnt orange here indicated by blue. You've got these red lines here, which the key tells us is intended to use for black, etc. So that makes it a lot easier to read and understand the backstitch, especially in areas where you're going to have backstitching that is next to a color that's fairly close to it, or black lines, which can be a little bit hard to differentiate from the black lines of the grid. So that's how you read the backstitch guide of a pattern as well. And if you ever get confused with your pattern, going back to your key is actually a pretty good place to start. If we take a look at the key here, we can see that all the information that we need in order to parse it is here. So these are your full stitches, and then you see these are divided off. These are our backstitch lines that tell us where those are as well. And then we've got our French knots here, and it shows us what symbol is being used for those French knots. And the same is true of the standard key rather than the backstitch guide key here. It's showing us the symbol that it's using to tell us where there's a French knot, so it helps us understand what we're seeing on the main page of the pattern. The key page also gives us some other vital information about the pattern. It'll tell you, in most cases, it'll tell you who the author is. It'll tell you any copyright information. It'll tell you the size of the grid that's on the page, and usually it'll tell you the size of the finished piece. Now, that finished piece is going to be completely dependent on the count the stitch density of the fabric that you use. One of the things we're going to do in the next episode is explain to you how to determine how big your piece is going to be based on the stitch dimensions. So here, our stitch dimensions are 26 by 42 inches. Now we can figure out what count it's assuming we're using based on math there, but we'll determine the size based on what type of fabric we decide to use. So in the next episode, we'll go over that as part of our starting. All right, so that about covers the basics of how to read your standard cross-stitch pattern. Next week, we're going to cover how to figure out where to start on the project. We're going to figure out how to figure out where to start on your fabric, and we're going to do those first couple of stitches to get the project going. Feel free to check out my store, sonovastitch.etsy.com, or find me on Facebook and Instagram. Both of those are Son of a Stitch. Well, Facebook is Son of a Stitch XS, because somebody had already taken Son of a Stitch, even spelled my weird ass way. Soon I'll have a Patreon available if you want to throw a few coins at the dancing monkey. But until then, I'll see you next time.